In the winter of 1527, a boat arrived at a lonely island off the Pacific shore of South America. It had come to rescue a ragged band of desperados who'd been searching the unknown for lands of gold. Their leader was an old conquistador called Francisco Pizarro.
Pizarro still believes that somewhere to the south there's an undiscovered world, but his men now have had enough of his promises. They just want to get out. He's a butcher, a savage. Get us off this hellish beach. And then Pizarro gets up and he takes his sword and draws a line in the sand. Friends and comrades, he says. This side of the line is danger, death, hunger, abandonment. This side of the line, comfort and safety. That side of the line, go back to Panama and you'll be poor. Cross over this side and you'll be rich beyond your wildest dreams. 13 of them cross over, the glorious 13 they called them, and they would participate in one of the most amazing events in the whole of history, the conquest of an empire which until that moment was unknown to the whole of the world, the empire of the Incas.
Unlike the Europeans, the Incas still lived in sacred time. For them, the sun was God, and every day they worshipped his first appearance from the bitter Andean night. And we thought this was the whole world, said one of them, for we knew of no other, until the Spanish came. In 1532, Pizarro returned to Peru with a small private army. With him were the survivors from his island, his hometown friends, and 4 of his brothers, as close-knit as a mafia clan. Ahead of them lay a vast empire, and the great Inca himself, Atahualpa. In November 1533, after months of trekking south, Pizarro reached the foot of the Andes, and we set out to follow in his footsteps.
Senora Quispe, Imana Kas Yankee. Mama, Macho, Alochai. Alochai. Wankiman.
At first, the local people fed the strangers. Pizarro himself slept in their houses.
Well, it'll be reasonably comfortable. I shouldn't have imagined things in terms of a matter.
He taught Spanish to 2 Indians, so he could converse in Quechua, the Inca language. And those nights, the Spanish gathered their first impressions of this great state and its people. How rational the Indians are, said Pizarro's secretary. The people seem very obedient to their rulers. Very good. Here, the Spaniards tasted potatoes for the first time, along with more exotic dishes.
There's an old story that in ancient Inca times,
there was a period of famine. The people were starving, and they discovered this furry little rodent among the rocks, and it was good to eat, and it saved them. They only eat it for special festivals, religious festivals and so on. They're doing it today because they've got a foreign guest.
Next day, we loaded up to follow Pizarro into the Andes.
It's an unbelievable thought, isn't it? Pizarro had 62 horse and 102 foot, plus some native allies from further up the coast. And he's entering an empire of 5 or 10 million.
Maybe if he knew, he
Yeah.
would go back
Yeah,
to
yeah,
Panama.
yeah. He hadn't seen the Inca army, had he?
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. He's a canny character, Pizarro. Illiterate, you know, middle-aged, tough as old boots, and very, very clever. He understood that the Incas were a civilization for all its wonders at the level of the Bronze Age, and that with guns, Toledo's swords, he could strike where it really hurt.
The roads of the Inca Empire stretched 3,000 miles from Chile to Ecuador, and this one led to the camp of the Inca himself at the town of Cajamarca. We followed a narrow, steep path, the Spanish said, straight up to the mountain peaks. It's still there, with its Inca steps.
Look at this. So is this Inca, Ricardo?
Well, there was nobody but the Incas who made this kind of work. You
Wow.
can see.
Look at this. Now, look, I've got the account of Pizarro's secretary of their journey coming up this pass. He talks about how steep the pass was. When they got to the top, it was defended by a fortress surrounded by stone walls, built on a hill with very steep rocks on either side. That's it. On his tracks, you see, this is the thing.
And you know, almost nobody knows this place in Peru.
Yeah, really.
It's amazing.
The Spaniards were seeing things no outsider had ever seen. The last moments of a world untouched since the dawn of history. After 5 days' march over the mountains, Pizarro came out above the town of Cajamarca.
Campfires of the enemy that night were a terrifying sight, the Spanish said. Like a brilliantly star-studded sky.
Atahualpa's army, they reckoned, was 30,000 strong. The Spaniards were on edge now. Why had they been allowed to come on unopposed? Were they walking into a trap? Pizarro's secretary tells the tale.
Few of us slept that night. We just talked about what we should do. All were full of fear, for we were so few and so deep into the land, and with no hope of rescue.
The Inca Atahualpa was taking the waters at the hot springs outside the town. And it was here that the two worlds first met. The Spanish advance party told Atahualpa that Pizarro loved him dearly and would fight for him against his enemies. And he smiled, said the Spanish, as if he didn't think much of us. Atahualpa told them they could stay in the town. Ominously, when the Spanish entered the town, they found it empty. They occupied a building on the square and waited to see what the Inca would do. Atahualpa's spies had been watching them all the way. His chief spy, Apu, reported back.
We know from several chroniclers what Apu reported. He reported to his boss, Atahualpa, the following. Number one, they are not gods.
They're not gods.
Not gods.
So the Inca knew that immediately.
Which is not to say that the people knew that. Okay, I've seen them, said Apo, I've seen them, I've seen how they get tired or sick, and a few of them died, and the gods don't die, they don't get sick. But they designed a plan, and they said, let's kill them all except 3 of them, who are going to be castrated. The horse breaker, the Iron Man.
The blacksmith,
the
guy who does the horseshoes and all the weaponry, yeah?
And the barber. The horsebreaker and the other one, of course, to establish the cavalry of Atahualpa. But the barber, because, and Apo said, because he knows something, he has powers. I have seen the people lining up in front of his tent, tired, really messed up. Yeah. And when they come out, I have seen them rejuvenated, fresh, health, and with the skin fresh as the baby's butt.
Yeah.
Atahualpa wanted to have Pizarro for lunch, but Pizarro had him for breakfast.
Down in the square, as the hours passed, the Spanish still waited. And I tell you, said one of them, we were wetting ourselves in terror. At last, Atahualpa entered the square on the shoulders of his courtiers. He was around 30, handsome and intelligent, the red royal tassel on his forehead, and a silky soft cloak made of the skins of vampire bats. It's funny what people remember at such moments of high tension. And the Spanish remembered the lilting song with which the people welcomed him. It's still sung today at festivals in the Andes. Pizarro watched with his captains and his priest Valverde. Atahualpa took his seat in the middle of the square.
Then the priest Valverde stepped forward with a cross and a prayer book, and he made a speech about Christ and the Pope and called upon the Inca to abandon his false religion and embrace Christ. I follow my religion, said Atahualpa, the undying sun and the ancient gods of the Incas. What is your authority for your religion? He said. The priest held up his book. Give it to me, said Atahualpa, so I may see if it speaks to me. And he turned the pages carefully and then looked up. Why does it say nothing to me? He said, and he threw the book on the floor. That was what Pizarro had been waiting for. It was the moment on which his whole career had converged. It gave him his pretext for war, and he gave the order to attack. And from the porticos all around this square, the Spanish came out,
and just opened fire on the masses of people crowded here.
Inca sticks and fans were no match for Spanish guns and steel. Some said 6,000 people died that night. As the rain fell, the square ran red with blood. But Atahualpa was captured alive. They took him in chains to a prison close by. It's still there. And now, Atahualpa made an astonishing offer to ransom himself. If they would set him free, he would fill the room with gold. On his desert island, had Pizarro ever imagined this? In his wildest dreams? The stories still told and retold across the Andes. But there are other Inca versions of the story. One of them, a unique manuscript discovered only in the 20th century.
Thank you very much. This is it. This is the famous Nueva Crónica and Buen Gobierno. It's really exciting to be facing this document, a document which is unique, because here you are not only see things that are valuable for the past, but also things that will help you to understand the present.
The author, Waman Poma, was a man of Inca descent.
This is the point of view of a vanquish, of one of those Indians who were conquered by the Spanish people. And he's always insistent, for example, that the real owners of the Indian territories are the Indians, and the Spaniards are the owners of Spain. And each one, if they, in their own realm, the thing is perfect, order is perfect. But if the Spaniards come here to the Indians and pretend to be the owners, then that is representing the disorder of the world, that the world is upside down.
The world is upside down.
The world is upside down.
To gather the gold, Atahualpa now ordered his people to allow the Spanish to travel freely through his empire. And the Spaniards set out on the greatest plundering raid in history. So why did Atahualpa do it? According to Waman Poma, the Inca had never seen the strangers as a threat. But now he thought, if he delivered the gold as promised, Pizarro would simply go away. At that time, says Waman Poma, we Indians lost all sense of direction. We forgot our gods and lost the authority of our rulers. So Pizarro's men stripped the gold off the greatest shrines in the Americas. Atahualpa filled his ransom room with 7 tons of it, one of the greatest treasures in all of history. He'd kept his word, but what would Pizarro do? Pizarro put Atahualpa on trial for treason. The jury, the Pizarro brothers and their friends. The verdict, the Inca must die. It was the most despicable thing we ever did in the Americas, said one conquistador. In the Andes, the people have never forgotten.
Inca yayata, hapi huchispa, siri payashpa, wañuchirkami. Puma shunguan, atuj makiwan, llamatashina tukuchirkami. Runduj urmashpa, illapantashpa, kawsaq runawan pambarirkami.
Puma shunguan is el corazón, the heart of a puma. See? And Yamatashina, they killed him like a llama.
For the Incas, these events were almost beyond belief. This was a Pachacuti, the world turned upside down. Pizarro now marched his army in triumph south on the Inca royal road 1,000 miles to the capital of the Inca Empire, Cuzco. On November the 15th, 1533, we Spaniards reached Cuzco. It was a wondrous thing to behold. No prize ever equaled this. The streets were grand, the palaces of finely jointed stone blocks of great antiquity. It was the richest town in all the Indies, founded by the first Inca and refounded in 1533 by Francisco Pizarro. And so at last, Pizarro looked down on his prize, the city of the Incas with its great ceremonial square and the huge palaces of the Inca royal clans. It was a turning point in the history of the world.
The Inca believed this place was the navel of the earth. It was the sacred center of the last of the civilizations to arise independently on the planet. And the fall of the city to the Spanish, coming so soon after the fall of Mexico, seems now like the beginning of the end for the traditional civilizations of the world. The end of sacred time, the triumph of profane time.
For Pizarro's expedition was a profit-making venture, backed by the bankers of Europe. And from now on, across the Atlantic, the talk was of nothing but Peru and gold. Europe was amazed. Spaniards flooded into Peru on a gold rush. The Pizarro brothers flaunted their newfound fortunes. For them, these were days of wonder, as they tightened their grip on the people and the riches of Peru. To win hearts and minds, the Pizarros appointed a puppet king, Atahualpa's half-brother Manco. But the Spaniards treated him with contempt, and to the Inca's horror, Gonzalo Pizarro raped Manco's wife and took her for himself. Word soon spread of a war of liberation. Manco summoned his leaders to a secret meeting. Perhaps it took place in the Inca Sun Temple, which still stands today inside a Cuzco church. Manco's words were recorded by his son, Titu Cusi.
"I've summoned you all here," said Manco, "because we all know now clearly who these foreigners really are.
They're not worthy people sent by God, but children of the devil. We've endured 1,000 insults. They've treated us like dogs while swearing to be our friends. Now, I want you to send your messengers throughout the whole country and summon all your forces to gather here in Cuzco in 20 days' time to attack them. Make sure that the bearded ones hear nothing about this, and we'll kill every last one of them. And then perhaps we may awaken from this nightmare.
Manco's plan was a concerted attack all over Peru. Above Cuzco, a vast Inca army gathered in the hills. The Spaniards were surrounded. Cut off in Lima, Francisco Pizarro sent frantic pleas to Mexico for help. Three relief columns were wiped out by Manco's armies. Here in Cuzco, Spanish survival hung on whether they could take the Inca fortress, which controlled the city at Sacsayhuaman. The Spaniards were outnumbered and at times outfought. Juan Pizarro was killed, but in the end, the Incas were outgunned.
The last battle for these walls was fought with a desperate heroism by the Inca warriors. Like the Aztec battle for Mexico City, it recalls the great classical epics like the Iliad, the Siege of Troy. And the last of the great Inca heroes, they say, stood on top of these rocks, armed with a European sword, throwing the Spanish off, killing members of his own side if they as much as thought of surrendering to the Spaniards. And in the end, when it was clearly all hopeless, he threw his weapons down, stuffed his mouth with earth, scourged his face, and threw himself off the rocks in fulfillment of his vow that he would die rather than give in to the Spanish.
And so our encirclement was broken, says Wamampoma. The Spaniards had bought themselves a breathing space. The Pizarros now took savage reprisals against the civilian population, the women and children who were helping Manco's army. A massive exodus followed as those who could fled north into the Sacred Valley. The Sacred Valley was the Inca heartland. Here they built their finest palaces, with huge terraces to grow maize and coca leaves. And here Manco and his high priest could call on the help of ancestors. At Machu Picchu, the mummies of the dead Incas could be brought out of their womb-like chambers to greet the sun. Their dead eyes regaled as in life with the vistas of the sacred peaks. According to Wamampoma, Manco built new terraces and houses here to feed and shelter the influx of troops and refugees. You can still see them at Ollantaytambo with its Inca housing plots and water channels. The Incas boasted that Manco had made this the strongest fortress in all Peru. And it was here that the Pizarros launched their next attack. They fought their way through the narrow lanes of the town. And then they attacked the fortress which towers above.
The Spaniards now sent a force of commandos right up on top to try and seize the rocks above the fortress.
Hernando Pizarro led the assault up these steps, while the Incas rained down missiles, spurred on by Manco, who rode the terraces above on a Spanish horse. Then, suddenly, the Indians hit us from every side, and to hear the roar of their army, it was as if the mountain was about to crash on top of us. For the first time, the Spanish had been beaten in a pitched battle. One more day and we would have killed them all, said Tito Cusi. My father's men laughed heartily at the Spanish rout, and how we celebrated our victory. Manco planned to make a new Cuzco here in the Sacred Valley. He even built a great council chamber carved with the royal pumas. By such monuments, he hoped to be remembered always, said Wamampoma. But Manco knew that Spanish colonists were pouring into Peru every month. Within a year, Manco realized that he would have to pull right out of Spanish reach, to the jungles the far side of the Andes. Peru would be partitioned. It must have been a heartbreaking moment for the young Inca.
When Manco had decided to retreat up the valley into the jungles of Vilcabamba, he made a speech to his loyal followers. Moving speech, too, a little like Bonnie Prince Charlie preparing to go over the sea to sky. He asked them to remember that his ancestors, the Incas of the past, had been good rulers, had cared for the people and provided for them. Don't forget that, he said, and don't let your children forget it. And then he said these extraordinary words, which are all the more striking now. I know, he said, that one day, in the future, the time will come when they will force us to worship their gods. And when that day comes, do what you have to do in front of them, but in private, don't forget our ceremonies and our gods. And if they try to force you to destroy our shrines, only reveal what you have to, and keep the rest hidden in your hearts.
So the Inca Empire was to be divided. Manco's court and his army began their long march over the Andes, demolishing the road behind them as they went.
Cold, nearly 13,000 feet. Oh, Lord. No wonder the hands are freezing cold.
But even now, the Incas still dreamed that one day they might return. On the far side of the mountains, Manco and his generals hoped to organize a new resistance. As Manco put it, to free the land of our forefathers. Manco destroyed the rope bridge here at Chaulé. The river was to be the boundary between the two worlds. But no one crossed the Pizarros. Gonzalo Pizarro now prepared to hunt Manco down. Manco's line of retreat had led him to a remote jungle hideaway at Vilcabamba, the lost city of the Incas. With him, Gonzalo took 300 of the toughest conquistadors, more than his brother had led to Cajamarca. And we set out to follow him.
Well, good. I've not got fleas. You may wonder why I'm scratching my hands. I've been bitten by the dreaded puma wakachi, which is the fly that makes even the puma cry. It's got me all over, it's true, isn't it? The puma wakachi, the Miguel wakachi.
The first stage of our trek in Pizarro's footsteps took us across bleak uplands over the last of the high passes towards Amazonia. Manco had retired to the farthest corner of the Inca world to create his new kingdom.
Buddy, buddy. So is this the pass, Carlos?
Yeah, this is Colpa Casa, the pass.
The Colpa Pasa?
Yeah.
What's that mean?
That's the highest point, highest pass on the trail.
Right, I'll catch you up in a minute, okay? The Colpa Pass, the high pass. About 12,400 feet. And this is the last of the passes before the road goes down and down and down towards the headwaters of the Amazon and down into Amazonia itself. When the Inca resistance headed this way, they were saying goodbye to their old homeland.
According to Wamampoma, Manco had pushed new roads into the interior. And on the second day, we found them.
This looks like Inca steps, yeah?
Yeah, it is, the Inca steps.
Quite well preserved up here.
Yeah.
Pizarro now scented blood. We cannot fail to get Manco now, he said, dead or alive. But Pizarro was too confident, and he fell into Manco's trap. Our guide, Don Juvenal, told us how the Incas had rolled stones down on the Spaniards, and there are still piles of rocks up there. 36 conquistadors were killed. Gonzalo was forced to retreat and wait for reinforcements before he dared push on. And Manco taunted him. I am Manco Inca. We have killed 2,000 Spaniards, and we will kill you too, and free our country. The following day, we came down through the clouds into sodden rainforests. In places, landslides had taken the path away. Such conditions must have sapped the morale even of Pizarro's hardened conquistadors. Finally, around 5 o'clock on the third day's march, we came in sight of Manco's lost city.
So, Don Juvenal, this is Espiritu Pampa.
Pampa. Espiritu Pampa. Espiritu Pampa.
See? So there it is. The lost valley of the Incas. The site of their last city. It's so secluded, so hidden that you can understand why it was never discovered until the 20th century.
And you can understand too why the last survivors of the Incas thought they might be safe here, hidden away from the rest of the world.
Pizarro had had to fight his way this far. But when he got here, the city was empty. Manco had disappeared into the jungle.
This is la plaza principal, Don Juvenal.
Sí, plaza principal. Aquí, chao plaza, man. Chao plaza, acá, chao plaza.
Today, Manco's city lies scattered over a square mile of forest, so choked with vegetation, it takes time to make out the shapes of the buildings and the terraces.
It's all on such a huge scale. This is the terracing of the great plaza in the middle of the city, on which stood the temple. And they brought all their most sacred relics here from Cuzco, the mummies of the last of the dead Incas, and above all, the most sacred relic, the punchao, the golden image that symbolized the rising sun, in whose chest was a heart made out of dough, made from the powder of the hearts of the dead Incas. They brought it all here to try to rebuild their world in the middle of the jungle.
Gonzalo searched these forests for 2 months, till sickness and starvation forced him to retreat. By his fingernails, Manco had survived. In his fury, Pizarro took revenge. He ordered Manco's wife shot with arrows and floated her down the river in a basket to be found by the Incas. Manco was grief-stricken, for he had loved her very much. Meanwhile, Pizarro's private empire began to fall apart. Like all mafia families, the Pizarros had made bitter enemies. In a scene from The Godfather, old Francisco, the discoverer and conqueror of Peru, was murdered by the son of his first business partner. Manco, meanwhile, had made his new capital at a place called Vitcos.
Fantastic. There's the Vilcabamba River. The Spanish described the place as being on a high mountain with wonderful views over the province of Vilcabamba. And on top, they say, there was a substantial flat area where majestic and sumptuous buildings had been erected with great skill and art. And you can see their ruins even from this distance.
Manco held court here for 7 years. The Spaniards were now fighting among themselves, and he sheltered enemies of the Pizarros. But there was a price on the Inca's head, and in the end, they got him.
This is all that remains of Manco's palace. Here's the finely sculpted lintels that the Spaniards mentioned. And here's the plaza where it all happened. Manco was about to play a game of quoits with horseshoes with his Spanish guests. It was a game he particularly liked. And his son, Tito Cusi, tells the story. My father was about to throw, he said, when one of the Spaniards stabbed him in the back. And my father tried to defend himself, but there were 7 of them. And he was unarmed, and they stabbed him and stabbed him and stabbed him, and he fell on the ground. And I wanted to defend him, Tito says, but I was only 9 years old. And they turned on me, and I was just terrified, and I ran off into the bushes. And though I was wounded in the leg, I escaped. But my father was killed.
Manco had been the one Inca who offered hope of long-term resistance.
So the Inca Empire ended. The political order was destroyed. But things exist in different levels in history, and empires are really just on the surface of history, and below them is a much deeper structure that lasts much longer. The long-lasting, tenacious, deep-rooted culture of the people of a region, shaped by their landscape and their climate. And up here in the Andes, the Inca people survived, and the beliefs survived. Just as Manco Inca had said, the people themselves did not forget.
Nearly 500 years on, the people of the Andes still revere the ancestral spirits of the Incas. Every year in June, they go up in their thousands onto the glaciers of the sacred mountains. And just before dawn, at a breathless 16,000 feet, they worship the ice of Coiloriti, the lord of the snow star. And afterwards, like their Inca ancestors, the people greet the rising sun. And then they sing the lilting song they sang to Atahualpa all those years ago. When the last Inca is dead, said old Francisco Pizarro, the people will weary of resistance and take our path. But the conquest is not over yet.